Everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Reformulating for the Future, GLP-1s, Protein Snacks, and On-the-Go Innovation. I'm Mark Crowell, founder of CNX, a clean label product development consultancy, celebrating our 20th anniversary this year, and I'll be your moderator today. We're in an exciting moment for food and beverage. The rise of GLP-1s, medications, changed how millions of consumers are approaching eating, satiety, and health. At the same time, protein snacks and convenient on-the-go solutions remain some of the fastest growing categories in the market. The question is, how do brands respond? What does it take to reformulate or innovate in a way that serves both the GLP-1 users and mainstream consumers who are all seeking balance, fullness, and functionality in their foods? Well, that's what we're going to explore today. And importantly, many of the questions we'll be discussing have come directly from you, our registrants and participants. So today's conversation reflects your real concerns and opportunities facing you today. So let's meet our panelists. Dr. Mickey Rubin is Vice President of Research at the American Egg Board, where he oversees scientific research and initiatives in nutrition, sustainability, and food safety on behalf of America's egg farmers and processors. Deanne Heyman, PhD, is the CEO of CCD Innovation and has more than 30 years experience designing foods, managing R&D groups, and translating consumer and technology trends into successful new products. And Andrea Swank is the Chief Marketing Officer for Egg Life Foods, an innovative startup, and has grown from a 200 store pilot to distribution in more than 15,000 retail locations across North America. Egg Life is now recognized as an industry disruptor and category leader, and is now on Instacart's fastest growing emerging brands list. So we're thrilled to have each of you here today to share your insights and expertise across science, innovation, and brand development. Before we dive in, let's hear from you guys to understand the role that you play in your organization so we can focus our conversation around your concerns. So we're going to put up the first poll now. Which of these best describes your job responsibility? We'll give you guys a minute to fill in your functional area. Before we put these poll results up, I was just reading earlier this week that the GLP drug market is going to be about $50 billion this year. Billion with a B. All right, what is your job responsibility? We've got 55% of the audience in the R&D area. That's a little heavier concentration than I expected, and that's going to be a really interesting part of the discussion today. 16% other, 13% are in the marketing and brand area, 10% executive, and 3% are in nutrition, health and wellness, and also in operations and supply chain. Thank you very much, Philip. Okay, well, we know where we're going with this conversation today, and I'm going to get us started off with the consumer behavior and market trends area, and I'm going to throw this first question to Mickey. How are GLP-1 medications changing consumer demand, Mickey, for high-protein snacks and convenient meal solutions?
Yeah, it's a good question, Mark. We're fortunate enough here at American Egg Board to have a really great consumer insights department, and they help us keep our finger on the pulse of the consumer. So we've seen, it seems like every time we turn around, there's another study on GLP-1 consumers, because as fast as it's growing, we need to continue trying to understand and research, the consumer preferences. I think we saw somewhere usage doubled between 23 to 20 and 24. So I've probably been more now in 2025. But what seems to be pretty consistent when you look at the consumer insights data is that, you know, consumers who are using GLP-1 medications, they're generally looking for, more fruits and vegetables. They're looking for more lean proteins. They're looking for protein shakes, which kind of makes a lot of sense. Some
Mhm.
things that kind of are, when you think about somebody who is not all that hungry, they kind of want to get, a little bit more bang for their buck. But they're also reducing things like, fewer cookies and baked goods, fewer fried foods, fewer salty snacks, which is really consistent. You're seeing consistency in the consumer insights data that you're seeing with what you're hearing anecdotally in clinical practice. Folks are just not craving those foods anymore. They're just not, there's obviously they're feeling more full from the medication, but that's also they're just that inclination, that drive, that cravings that they have for those, traditional comfort salty snacks or sugary snacks. They're just not there anymore. And so, when you're in the research, when you see consistency across a couple of different avenues, like you're seeing it consistent in the consistency from consumer insights data that you're hearing from anecdotally in clinical practice that you're seeing in some other areas as well. That kind of gives you a lot of confidence that what you're seeing is real. So yeah, these folks are just not craving those sort of indulgent snacks the way they used to, and it shows in their purchasing.
Andrea, as a CMO, you've lived through massive growth in protein forward products and including your own. Which consumer segments, busy professionals, parents, athletes, do you think are most likely to drive the next wave of on-the-go protein innovation?
Yeah, it's a great question and a really exciting time to be in the protein space. I feel like it's something that's gaining relevancy for pretty much every consumer group, which is really interesting. And so at Egg Life, we're really seeing this convergence from multiple consumer segments, including busy parents, including working professionals who are pressed for time, maybe going back into the office for the first time in a couple of years and navigating, shifting lifestyles and behaviors and needs there. But also wellness focused consumers and health conscious consumers that are trying to figure out how to do life just a little bit better. Um, they're all craving more convenient protein options. And I think, at the end of the day, it's interesting when you have something that is additive in nature. I think you think about a lot of like the diets and lifestyles that people were looking towards in the past were all about eliminating things. There was the low fat craze. There, more recently, carbs, were the enemy. And protein is something that is positive and additive in nature that people feel good about eating. And so I think it's this really interesting opportunity for brands to lean into something with a more positive, potentially message that's really resonating with a whole bunch of consumers today.
Deanne, building on that from your innovation lens, what consumer trends feel like sort of short-term spikes, versus longer-term trends?
Yeah, I know. When I think about short-term spikes, I kind of think about things that are, okay, variety, excitement, quick, accessible engagement. And so one of the recent social media sensations, right, was the cottage cheese ice cream. And I think it literally resorted in huge outages, right, across a lot of retail outlets. And I think the latest one is chaffles, where people are putting cheese in their waffle irons. My daughter asked me the other day, Mom, do we have a waffle iron? And I was like, yeah, hopefully not. But anyway, and my favorite short-term seasonal one that comes along right now is pumpkin spice, right? So the spikes, right, versus something that's going to be a longer term trend, which I always think of as a fundamental shift in the category. And it really comes about or it sticks either because we've changed the way we believe about something, even a generational belief, or how we understand something has changed. So, near and dear to me, it comes about because in a lot of cases, it's because the scientific knowledge around an area has changed. So it's fundamentally changed what we understand about food. And because of that, to have a successful presence in a category, you almost have to address these things that have become table stakes. Like if you think about Greek yogurt, that really reset our expectations around the category in terms of not just how it's marketed, right? But literally the levels of fat and the way the texture is from that product now, the whole expectation has shifted. Or even gluten-free, right? You go to the store now and there's a whole retail set for that, most typically, where that didn't exist before. So, and a couple, there's a lot of examples, right, for all of us who have been in the food industry a while. And if I think about, a short-term fad shifting even into a longer-term trend, you think about alt meats, right? There have been a lot of competitors in the category coming and going, some spikes, some declines now in the alt meat category. But the long-term and durable part seems to be a fundamental shift in the acceptance of a flexitarian diet, right? So meatless meals have become ingrained in lifestyles, and it's very common, right? People they're a lot more accepting of that, if you will. And same kind of corollary for the dairy industry, right? In plant-based milks, where we saw more recently a big spike in oat milk when oat milk came about. I think honestly introducing a lot of some of the challenges that were in the category around taste and flavor. But again, the staying power of short-term spikes is, and I read this and it was kind of staggering, but I like it, where it said 50% of US households now buy both dairy and non-dairy, yeah, beverages when they're coming to on their regular purchasing cycle, right? So, and there's multiple other examples, and I won't keep going on, but sugary soda consumption for sure, right? Down significantly, down 25%, since even the late 90s, if you will. And bottled water is now the number one beverage by volume. And we see the low no alcohol shift, right? Because of a generational belief about drinking, and even now prebiotics in our sodas, right? And a lot of that is based on knowledge of the microbiome and people's acceptability of prebiotics and seeing that and understanding even what that is.
I love those examples at the end, Deanne, around what's really big and sort of generational in terms of shifts, and what are those shorter term things that might feed in to a bigger trend, or they might fade away. It just takes time to tell, but you put your finger on some of those really big shifts that we've seen happen over decades. The growth of bottled water is a great example of that. And then some of the newer trends. So, great segue. Nutrition and health science, opening up that topic. Mickey, coming back to you. Many people ask, how should brands think about protein and satiety in a GLP-1 world?
Yeah, really good question. And I'll say, this is my scientist plug here. We actually need a lot more nutrition research around GLP-1 users. These drugs have been on the market for 20 years. So we have a lot of data, we have a lot of safety data, all good. But what we need a little bit more of is nutrition, research with GLP-1 users. These drugs started off as diabetes drugs. The first one came to market back in 04, 05. And then back then is when they realized, hey, there's this one curious side effect of these GLP-1 drugs for type 2 diabetes is everybody tends to lose a lot of weight, right? And then so then fast forward 20 years and here we are. So we have a lot of really strong data on these different compounds and how they impact both diabetes and how they impact weight loss. So what's interesting is, all those studies are, just background healthy diets. We don't necessarily have a lot of now, have a lot on specific foods or macronutrients. But what we do know is, when you look at weight loss and when you look at sometimes rapid weight loss, and it doesn't matter if that's in a GLP-1 therapy context or another rapid weight loss context, what you tend to see is both a loss in fat mass as well as a loss in muscle mass, and sometimes even bone mass. And so that is something that when you look about how you can mitigate that with diet, that's when we start hearing more about the importance of protein. right? For folks that are losing weight pretty quickly, and really to kind of, well, how do we shore up the, what we need to in terms of maintaining muscle and bone mass? Protein is probably going to lead the way in terms of our macronutrient that we want to focus on in this context. And really it gets back to, what's your nutrition bang for the buck? So when I think about that, I think of what are higher quality proteins that have all of the essential amino acids that we need, that our bodies can absorb all those essential amino acids. That's kind of what we think about when we think about protein quality. Many of people listening probably understand the concept of protein quality, and we see those, some of those animal source foods, whether it's eggs or dairy, as an example, that have that highest quality protein. If folks are not able to eat a lot, uh, their calorie their calorie intake is low, then we want the quality of that diet to be as maximized as possible. So that means the higher quality of the protein, the better. We'll talk about maybe some micronutrients in a little bit. But think about the GLP-1 user kind of like how you would think about your fitness consumer, right? They're thinking about protein for fitness reasons. They're exercising. We actually probably want to encourage the GLP-1 users to participate in exercise too. That helps them maintain that muscle as well. But I kind of think about these different consumers in the same way. They kind of need the same support in terms of muscle mass and bone mass, and what nutrients that we need to help focus there. So,
Well, you opened the door to the $64,000 question. Deanne, when thinking about designing these products, trying to deliver this satiety, people don't want to eat as much. We're talking about getting a lot of protein into the products that they're eating. So, how do you formulate for that? I mean, satiety is not just a single nutrient story around protein. What should you consider in that full design matrix?
Yeah, and I think thanks, Mark, for that great question around if I'm thinking about designing for GLP-1 users or even for non-GLP-1 users, right, in terms of addressing and creating satiety, and maybe even for these folks when they come off the medication, right, I think is important to think about when they can achieve that. But if you're going to design satiety-focused products, right, you're thinking about curbing initial hunger and sustaining fullness, right? And so nutrient combinations are incredibly powerful when you bring things like protein, fiber, healthy fats, if you will, and then low glycemic, slow digestible impact on the carbohydrate side, right? So you've got to find these food components that almost behave the same, right, as the GLP-1 agonist drugs. So they're slowing down stomach emptying, they're reducing appetite, right? And the most powerful thing we can do, it's not a single nutrient story, to your point, Mark. There's quite a bit of science around macronutrients like protein and fiber and how those blends together slow gastric emptying, stabilize the blood sugar, and ultimately keep you feeling fuller longer. And Mickey touched on this too. If you think about the protein components you're working with, you really want to focus on both high quality proteins and fast and slow digesting protein components, right? So not including high quality protein goes without saying, right? So in whey and egg and whole proteins like eggs, meat, and dairy, and fast and slow digesting proteins. So I'm able to extend satiety and the satiety impact, but also improve muscle protein synthesis through some of the proteins that have the branched chain fatty acid content because of that muscle loss in GLP-1 users. And secondly, but not any less important, is combining the protein content along with fiber, right? Looking at a mix of both soluble and insoluble fibers, because we know that those also create immediate fullness and prolong satiety. So working with soluble fibers that increase kind of the viscosity in the stomach and slow stomach emptying. Ultimately, those get fermented in the lower gut, give us a great microbiome benefit in the lower GI tract. And then also insoluble fiber, right? Really increasing transit time in the GI tract. And I said I would say this, but a shout out to fiber, right? And the fact that fiber still remains a significant macronutrient in our diet. It's still the #1 macronutrient that's deficient in the US diet. And so I love the power of protein and what we're doing in that, but a strong plea to bring fiber along with that, right? To create that ultimate satiety impact, if you will. And then finally, I would just say, if we're thinking about designing a system for GLP-1 users where they may not be eating a lot, it's incredibly critical that we design this entire system, right? So we're designing an entire system of food with both protein, fiber, the healthy fats, and the slow digesting carbs, but creating beneficial, we like to call it nutrient density, right? Ensuring that the amount of nutrition that they need to get even in this small system is delivered to them.
Well, it's a whole new way of thinking for some of us in the product development space to really get that nutrition science into the formulation. So, I'm wondering, Andrea, from a consumer messaging standpoint, how do brands balance the satiety benefits of these products without overstating the GLP-1 friendly claims?
100%. Yeah, I think the temptation can be to chase headlines to drive relevancy and try to, create meaningful connection by like hitching your wagon to something that's, trending and hot. But ultimately, I think credibility is everything. And I think, Mickey said it well in that, consumers that are on a GLP-1 drug are often on a weight loss journey. And it's not just consumers on a weight loss journey who are looking for protein and satiety. There's a whole bunch of consumers. And so going to the core of like, what is that consumer need state that they're trying to solve for? And what is the relevant message that's going to meet them where they are is really what we choose to focus on. And nutrient density and protein density is something that we've found a lot of relevancy for as a brand. And instead of more bang for your buck, we like to think about it as more bang for your bite. You're often consuming fewer calories, and how do you make those calories work as hard as you can, metabolically? And so, what is the makeup of that? And it plays into, the protein density of the food, but also the protein quality, and what are you getting for that caloric intake? And I think we're also really careful at Egg Life to make sure that we don't alienate consumers or regulators for that matter by overstating things and making sure that we're clear about what does the brand have the right to say versus where do we rely on the expertise of other people to carry a message. So we may tap into registered dietitians, healthcare professionals, food scientists, to help tell a story or bring certain product attributes to life in a meaningful way where it may not make sense for the brand to tell that story. And so it's about having the right message and the right mouthpiece to deliver that communication to the consumers that you're trying to reach. And then ultimately really focusing on those universally relevant benefits versus just saying this is a GLP-1 product. It's like, well, why is this a fit for not only GLP-1 consumers, but other consumers looking for
Right.
things like protein and satiety?
Great point. And so let's ask you, the audience, what's your biggest innovation challenge today with respect to reformulating for a GLP-1 world, taking into consideration some of these balance issues that Andrea was just speaking about? Let's put up our second poll, Philip. Take just a minute for you guys to fill in your answers. So I mentioned earlier, $50 billion in GLP-1 drug sales this year, but the more astounding statistic to me was the negative impact to food sales could also run about $50 billion this year. That is a staggering number. All right, so here we have our responses. 42% of you said formulation, product performance related issues. And I am not at all surprised by that number, given the complexity of what we've talked about in terms of protein quality and messaging and audiences. Cost and sourcing ingredients was the number 2 issue, 21% of you mentioned. 17% mentioned regulatory, labeling, and claims. 13% mentioned internal resources and speed to market. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And 8% mentioned others. Super interesting. All right. Well, let's continue on the conversation with some more specific discussion about how do you innovate in this area, and what if you're reformulating existing products? Deanne, biggest formulation challenges when boosting protein in bars, chips, wraps, some of these really high volume areas, growing segments without compromising taste or texture?
Great question, Mark. Great question. And I think about all three of those formats, they're all challenges, right? And they each need to be addressed in a unique way. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges and one of the most intriguing parts of the food and the food systems we work with as developers is that every solution is specific to a product format, and it's very bespoke. Right. And I always think back to my history. Explaining that to senior executives in a company is sometimes an interesting journey, right? But it does tend to be very, very true, right? The challenges within each system are very, very bespoke, right? And I think our consumers are telling us, and even our development scientists are telling us, texture, right, is that one of the most difficult places that we've almost had yet to tackle, right? And as I've looked at it, and I've looked at the challenges that have come to us in terms of product development within CCD innovation, texture tends to be the area where I've seen we have the least progressive tools. And maybe folks on the line will argue with me, right? But the taste tools that we have seem to be far more advanced than texture tools. And so, consumers are parroting that back to us also, right? We've gotten better on the taste side and the flavor blocking side, if you will, masking, but maybe not so much on texture. And so for taste, we know we still struggle a bit with beanie and dairy off notes, right? Mouthfeel and astringency are one of the biggest challenges that is still out there. But there's a couple key ways to come at that, right? Making choices around different protein blends you can even use as a solution to achieve better flavor, right? Probably not only flavor, but texture as well.
Yeah.
So looking at pea and rice blends, whey protein with collagen, just looking at how do I get better flavor overall and how do I reduce chalkiness. And flavor technology from a lot of our real strong global partners is where I've seen a lot of progress with real effective choices around maskers, looking at bitterness and astringency, as well as choosing a specific flavor camp like vanilla or caramel or nut or something like that to hide some residual bitter notes. And in the texture camp, doing the protein blends to address grittiness, still the same, looking at, narrow particle size on some of your protein isolates. And then there's what I call the workaround, right? Where I'm going to manage the rest of the components in the system to try to minimize how protein behaves through texture or how textural changes happen over time, right? So thinking about hydrocolloids and how do I manage bound water in the system so I can prevent crystallization and things like that. How do I plasticize, to improve texture? So, and then I think the last comment I would make, Mark, is I was trying to figure out where to squeeze this in because I'm completely intrigued by it. On one side, I'm designing food to block off flavors and off textures and things for a target audience. On the flip side, we've started to see some emerging newer sensory studies that are indicating the GLP-1 drugs can actually alter taste perception in the users, either dampening or changing it. making
Yeah.
certain foods taste bitter and metallic. And so um, I talked earlier about how scientific knowledge changes the way we think about things and do things. It's potentially going to ask us to create even better tools for how do I manage for this group of folks who, not only are they not hungry, but foods actually don't taste good.
Mm.
Right? So
Same problem with airline food. When you get up at altitude and the cabin
yes,
has a 8,000-foot atmosphere, it changes your
yes,
taste
perception.
perceptions, dulls them. So
So
super interesting that you bring that up, Deanne. Mickey, on ingredient technology, what's happening? What's
Yeah,
the
no,
latest?
I'd like to jump on. Deanne made such a great point about texture. I just kind of want to jump on that for a little bit because I think, especially for GLP-1 users, this is an issue. One of the things that I've seen recently in the nutrition research literature, and again, there's not a lot, but recently there was a position stand that was authored by a group of obesity experts and published by the American Society of Nutrition and the Obesity Society that kind of started to address nutritional priorities to support GLP-1 therapy users for obesity. Excuse me. And one of the things that they said, which I thought was, really insightful, was when it comes to protein, perhaps to focus on lower volume protein foods, because we have a situation where folks are just not able to or not desiring to eat a whole lot. And and so with the examples they gave were eggs or also nut butters and things like that, which are lower volume, they're not very dense, they're not very heavy, but they can go down pretty easily and not feel very heavy to the person consuming it. And the texture is easier, right? So getting that high quality protein in a lower volume, texture that could really help somebody who's on GLP-1 therapy, I think is a really critical point. So I just want to, I love the point that Deanne made. So I just want to emphasize that because it made me think of this position stand and the suggestion for lower volume protein foods. In terms of eggs, I think there's a lot of opportunity. We have our innovation team who runs our accelerator lab, which partners with folks from across the food industry, and we have experts that help them reformulate eggs and find uses for eggs and where eggs could play a role. I think there's a lot of opportunity there because when just thinking of eggs and a scrambled egg and how you're getting so much in it, so much nutrition, so much protein in it for so low, light volume. I think of the egg life wrap. I think of the same thing. You're getting so much in such a light volume. I think that's where we really, that's an important area to focus for these folks because again, they're not that hungry. They're quite literally taking the most powerful satiety-inducing agent known to man, right? They don't, they're 30 times higher than their natural GLP-1 levels would normally be at any given time. So, we just need to figure out a way to get them the nutrition that they need in a way that they're going to, get it in easily.
Well, we were talking about ingredient technology, but where you went with that, Mickey, made me think about processing
Yeah,
technology and
yeah,
like, the idea of peanut butters and maybe whipping more air or
yeah,
emulsification
exactly.
technology where it really fundamentally changes the texture
Yeah.
of products or ingredients. Andrea, like more strategically, should brands focus on reformulating existing SKUs for higher protein and satiety, or should they invest in entirely new product lines?
Yeah, I don't think it's either or. I think it really comes down to really understanding where the consumer need is the strongest, first and foremost. What are they looking for? And then what makes sense for your brand? I think reformulation can certainly unlock some quick wins, perhaps in existing trusted categories. Maybe try to drive premiumization, incrementality, think about existing brands and categories in a new and perhaps more relevant manner. But ultimately, new products are where you can redefine the landscape altogether. And I'm clearly biased, but at Egg Life, we've seen enormous traction where we've given consumers a way to consume eggs that they didn't even know that they needed in the form of a wrap made from egg whites. And so, we're creating a whole entire category, not reformulating, an existing product. And so that said, we're also continually iterating on our wraps and, trying to make sure that taste and texture and nutrition, are keeping pace with evolving expectations of consumers as we do learn more, have more data points from consumers, both using GLP-1 drugs, also just consumers consuming egg life wraps and understanding, what, if anything, could be better about the experience. And I think, ultimately for any brand, the decision needs to be guided by consumer insight and also speed. Where can you deliver the greatest impact the quickest, but always with an eye towards taste and quality, because those two things are table stakes. It has to taste good or consumers will not buy it. So, yeah.
Let's zoom out for a second, Andrea, and just talk business strategy and brand positioning. I'm really intrigued by not only your products, but your brand and the way the brand has grown and gotten traction with consumers. It's protein forward, obviously, but you've done some other things to really make that resonate with consumers, both the GLP-1
Mhm.
user and others. How are you doing that?
Yeah. We are really focused on anchoring our messaging and our positioning in kind of the intersection of three consumer truths, being taste, nutrition, and convenience. And Egg Life lives at the intersection of those three distinct need states. And protein is the main entry point into brand Egg Life. It is the main driver of purchase for our product. But really, what we've found to be true is that it's the joy that our fans express when they unlock the magic of our products. And ultimately, it's the versatility that our products provide consumers, that makes them come back for more and become habitual users of the product. And I really underappreciated that, honestly, before I joined the company, the versatility that the product really provides. Um, the things that we hear most often from consumers are, I'm obsessed with your wraps, or your wraps have been a game changer. They've really unlocked this idea of food freedom and the ability to participate in perhaps different food experiences that were off limits to them before, either because of dietary restrictions, or just by choice of the types of foods that they want, to be consuming. And so, it's really been important that we kind of anchor in that intersection of taste, nutrition, and convenience, and really come from a place of participation and kind of inviting everyone to be at the table. So inclusive of GLP-1 consumers, but really any consumer that's looking for, a protein-packed, low-carb alternative.
Well, thanks for those insights into kind of what's making the brand tick, and it all makes perfect sense. I wonder if we like zoom out one more level, Deanne, and we talk partnerships for a minute. What role is that playing, these collaborations with nutrition boards? Andrew's talking about, well, you don't have to give every message you're trying to give from a brand. You could be strategic about where messaging comes from, ingredient suppliers, and then let's talk startups a little bit. So many startups are playing in this space and accelerating protein forward products. What role do those partnerships play?
Yeah, they're significant. I'll embellish beyond that, but it's near and dear to my heart. I've been kind of dabbling in this space, honestly, in my R&D roles for the last 10 plus years. But no one's positioned well enough to be able to tackle and address all the shifts coming at us, right? So partnerships externally are incredibly imperative. If you think through a lens of like the build, borrow, buy strategy, if you will, I'm a huge believer in external partnerships and open innovation, building an ecosystem around you that incorporates a lot of different partners with all different skill sets. They work at different points in your innovation pipeline, if you will, your renovation pipeline, and they all bring different strengths, right? So you need to decide as a company who's leading the technology work in the space, who has the technology that meets your need, right? And there might be several. And I used to joke with the business team folks I worked with that, and they would say, "Well, which technology should we be placing our bet on?" And I said, "Well, it's the one that you choose, right? It's the one you choose to ride, the horse, right? If you will, where are you going to invest your money for the long term?" And outside of maybe just startups, Mark, if you look at larger, more strategic, like ingredient companies, flavor companies, et cetera, deciding if you're going to have a strategic partnership with them. And that means different things to different people, but a lot of it comes down to transparency and trust that you have between those two partners. So if you have that, it's incredibly important. It allows the innovation process to flow more quickly and without a lot of roadblocks, right? Because innovation is happening quickly and the need to get to the marketplace in a space happens quickly. So if you think about the strategic partners, not only critical to say this is the one we're going to place our bet on, but then you have to stay in it for the long haul, right? You have to prioritize investment within a company to keep that flowing into a startup that you might be investing in. And you have to do that over multiple years. Then you've got to think about, how do I transition that technology that might provide me a unique competitive advantage into your portfolio of brands, right? And then translate that into market for a competitive advantage. There's another model that I love that I've had a little bit of experience with, which is really around consortiums and non-competitive partnerships. At CCD Innovation, and we're part of JPG Resources. And we sit in with a group called MISTA, which was created by the Givaudan team. And that is a non-competitive consortium, if you will, solving big food system problems, right? And so we sit there with all different members, and we're really raising the bar in terms of how we're advancing technologies and what we understand about solving problems. You also have companies like Pulpex, right, who have created this non-competitive partnership around solving big problems like recyclable bottles or compostable in paper bottle systems. So just love the model. There's a lot of ways to come at it, and you really need to think strategically about how you're leveraging external partnerships.
These are big decisions, huge bets for the larger companies. Mickey, let's close with a view of the future. What does success look like for food brands leaning into GLP-1 satiety trends versus those who are like holding back, waiting to see kind of how this whole thing plays out?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, to your second point there, I think the time is now, right? I think the opportunity is now to lean into it. And I think there's a couple of things that I think about when leaning into it now. Number one, I think the time is now, but I would recommend everybody take the long view, right? If this is the long game. We still are in the infancy of understanding these therapies, right? Their impact on people and long term, and and maybe there's still more in development. There, we know the oral medications are in development, and that's going to be another game changer when those come out. So we
Right.
still have a lot to learn. So I very much recommend the long game here. But I think you know you can start now and really by leaning into it and really create some brand loyalty. And the way in which you do that is you really think about what you're doing and what you're developing as, how can I help that GLP-1 user? I think Andrea said something earlier that I thought was really, everybody's they're on this weight loss journey, which I've been in nutrition research now for 20 plus years. It is hard, right? And no matter if you're on a GLP-1 drug or not, or whatever diet or whatever plan that's working for you, it works, or it's all hard. Show that as a brand, you are there to support these people, and then you can develop that brand loyalty for the long term. And then as we learn more, as the drugs themselves change, as the oral medications come out, and usage is going to go sky high even more when oral medications are out, you know, then you can adapt, you can pivot, but you've sort of already established that positioning early on, that you're a brand that is there to support these people in this difficult journey. So that's where I would focus.
That's great advice, Mickey. And you really draw the picture of a marketplace and product lines that are continually evolving along with the science. So don't get fixated on
Yeah.
what's out there today, what exists today, and what the market is saying today, but the bigger picture, people are still going to want to lose weight in
Yeah.
some form or fashion, and however that changes, the brand that you're developing and supporting can still play there. So, what's the one piece of advice you give to brands trying to responsibly communicate about the science?
To me,
Yes,
yeah.
Mickey.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
So again, and this is I lived and breathed this for 20 years. Your claims and your messages have to be credible. They can't go out, they can't go too far. Obviously, we're all under the umbrella of FTC and FDA regulations, but really, it's got to be credible. Don't. I think in weight loss, to me, and this is one area where I don't like pushing the boundaries. Focus on what you can do to help these people, how you can be supportive of people in this journey. That and then you're going to be in a good space. But make sure your claims and messages are credible. They are science-based. We have some more science to do for sure. But
Right.
there's some low-hanging fruit on that science, right? So we need more science on understanding what other nutrients GLP-1 users might be deficient in, what micronutrients they might be deficient in, B12, calcium, all these other things that might be an issue for somebody who's eating so much less. So let's do more research to support potential claims, but make sure those claims are credible.
Great advice, Mickey. Deanne, what's the most important mind shift change for R&D leaders when it comes to designing products for satiety or the GLP-1 market in particular?
Yeah, I think just with the incredible impact and emergence of this space, R&D leaders really need to think about, how your organization will respond to that trend, right? Does my organization, my people have the tools and the know-how they need, or do they have access to the tools and the know-how to be able to respond to that trend? So it leans back a little bit into my partnership discussion. We don't know how this whole satiety space, the need, the demand will grow. Mickey just mentioned as the oral drugs come out in the space, how the science around the drugs will impact our understanding and all the shifts around that. But you do need to focus on and be aware of within your organization and your function in the broader organization, do you have a short-term ability to respond? I love it. Andrea said, what does your brand have the right to say? To understand that fundamentally, and then really think about the long-term impact of that need and that emerging need on the health of your business and your foods and your brands.
That's great context. And Andrea, so what's the most powerful way to connect protein forward products to everyday consumer needs?
Totally. I think first you have to make sure that you take the time to understand your consumers and meet them where they are. Understand what's going on with them. They're rushing between commitments. They're trying to fuel their families. They're balancing wellness goals with real life. They might be eating smaller meals. How is how they're consuming food shifting? What are the pain points that you might be able to solve for them? And then for protein forward foods as you're developing them, show them how you can easily slip those into those existing routines. Consumers don't want to do a lot of extra work, so how do you make it easy for them? We talk a lot about egg life being a simple swap. We're not asking you to make whole lifestyle changes. It's just this versus that. It's very simple. And then ultimately tying back to aspiration and balancing the functional needs and role that the product is playing with the emotional benefit that the consumer is ultimately seeking. And so, when we think about protein and egg life in particular, we like this idea of it's not just fuel, but it's freedom. We want to provide our consumers joy and confidence in how they eat. And like Mickey said, it's about supporting them on that journey and being a partner, with them and an enabler. And I think when consumers feel like food that they're eating and brands that they're supporting support their life rather than restricting it, that's really when the win-win situation happens between brands and consumers, and ultimately you can win the hearts and the carts, of those consumers as a brand.
Hearts and carts. I love that. Well, listen, thank you, Mickey, Deanne, Andrea. Your expertise was amazing today. We really got an in-depth look at so many aspects of the GLP-1 journey that people are on and how to formulate foods for people that are not on that journey but are interested in that protein in those products and how to make those products better. So thanks to all of you also in the audience today for joining us and sending us in your thoughtful questions and comments that help shape the discussion. There's one message we'd like you to take away today. It's this: GLP-1 trends aren't a momentary blip. This represents a huge consumer shift in how people are eating for satiety, for balance, and for functional nutrition. And brands that innovate thoughtfully with the science and consumer in mind will be best positioned to succeed in the future. At CNX, we work with companies every day on clean label innovation and reformulation. And if you'd like to continue the conversation with us or with any of today's panelists, please reach out. We'd love to talk. You will all be getting a link to the webinar where you'll be able to get a recording of it. And I'd like to ask if you would just take a minute before you sign off with us today. We have about 7 minutes left. We've got a last poll for you to take to just tell us how your overall satisfaction was with today's webinar and what we can do better for the next time. So we'll go ahead and put that up, and we'd love to get your comments. And we will be back next month with another webinar. And probably I should tell you what it is, but I'll need Philip to help me there.
The webinar in October, at the end of the month, will be on reformulation through the lens of cost savings. As we get to Q4, we start to make budgets as organizations for next year. We try to figure out ways to save costs, increase profit, and still deliver the high quality that our consumers expect.
Reformulation for cost savings sounds like it might be a very popular subject in Q4. So please join us for that. And thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully, we'll see you next month. Take care, everybody.